Hello and welcome to another episode of More Than Couture. I am your wonderful, gracious, and humble, but not too humble because I'm a Leo, host, Kevonni Couture. And yes, welcome to the second episode of my podcast. I just want to start today's episode off with a new segment called Random Thought of the Week. And for today's random thought of the week, I don't know why this just so happened to cross my mind one day when I was getting ready to go to bed. And many years ago, back when I was in high school, I used to go to church with one of my friends. And this particular day, there was a sermon that was preached, and it is hands down the most unforgettable sermon that I've heard. Like, I literally don't remember any other sermon that I've heard in my lifetime. And I've been to several churches. I've been to many churches. And this sermon in particular just really just stuck with me. So it was, I don't think she was a guest preacher. She was a regular goer of the church, but I don't remember exactly what her position was in the church, but she was preaching this particular Sunday, and the regular pastor of the church was not. So in her sermon, this isn't a word for word quote, but just getting the gist of what she said. So the sermon went something like this. This is one of the quotes. It's too many people popping that coochie instead of popping that question. I'm going to repeat it for you one more time. It's too many people popping that coochie instead of popping that question. And when I tell you the whole church, girl, this wasn't a little church. This was a big church. This was a 2-story church. Big church. It was a thing. It was child, it was an ordeal. I mean, I'm surprised nobody had a heart attack in there. That lady said coochie in church. And, I get what she was saying. Just the gist of what she was saying is there's too many baby mamas and baby daddies and not enough husband and wives. I get where you was going, but the people that's popping the coochie is not the same people that's popping the questions. There's 2 different sets of people. But I will say, if you're going to pop that coochie, girl, you got to pop responsibly. It's all this birth control out here. And all birth controls are not going to work for you. It's very hit or miss. You just have to find the right birth control for you. But, I'm all about popping the coochie responsibly. Let's just be responsible about it. Let's not keep having these kids with these deadbeats. That's what I'm gonna say. That's how I conduct my life. And popping that coochie instead of popping that question, it really stuck with me. A lot of things really stuck with me in my life, and that is definitely one of them. And that is why I don't have no kids. That is one of the reasons why I don't have no kids, and why I'm I spoke on this on the Les podcast, but I'm really I just really want to be married before I have kids. Not that, having a husband is an insurance policy or not becoming a single mother. I realize that, you can still become a single mother even if you get married, but, the chances are a lot less. And I will get deeper into that on another episode of the podcast. But for today, that is not the topic at hand. So let's get into today's topic. Today's topic is going to be revolving around whether or not you should start a podcast with your friend. So I am going to be speaking from a place of someone who had a podcast with a friend and my personal experience, and we'll also be taking a not deep dive It's not going to be a deep dive at all, but I do want to give you guys some examples of podcasts, very big popular podcasts where, the podcast didn't work out and the friendships also didn't work out and they kind of dissolved with the podcast. So let's just get into it. So first, I kind of want to give you guys the examples that I was speaking of. And the first one we're going to discuss is the Call Her Daddy podcast. And if you're not familiar with Call Her Daddy, it is super, super, super popular. And, being that I'm a Black woman, I'm going to assume that majority of my podcast audience is going to be Black women and just Black people in general. So I'm just going to assume you might not know what that podcast is or what it's about. So originally when it first started out with 2 co-hosts, and it was very much like a very sex positive type of podcast. So kind of talking about sex and things like that. Things that are considered to be taboo, but not so much anymore. But coming into 2022, before the 2020s, back in the 2010s may have been considered taboo. But yeah, so the podcast started before the pandemic, and it was 2 best friends. And to make a long story short, because you could really, I suggest if you really want to know the ins and outs of this situation, after I go over a brief overview, to watch Smokey Glow's video on the Call Her Daddy podcast. She goes really in depth into the whole falling out of the podcast, how it was started, all that. But just to give you a brief overview, 2 best friends, they started a podcast. The podcast was really successful really early on. So they got picked up after about 4 episodes of their podcast by a network who produces other podcasts. But it was mostly sports podcasts. So they were something new. And basically, pretty much, they started getting millions of views on their podcast. And after about a year or 2 of the podcast, it was time to renegotiate their terms of their contracts. And when it came to negotiate the terms, the 2 friends were not in agreement on what they wanted as far as what to be in the contract. And pretty much the one friend decided to continue on with the podcast without the other friend. And and then that friend that stayed with the podcast ended up getting a $60 million deal with Spotify. Yeah. Sickening. Girl, you talk about somebody fumbling a bag. Girl, are you kidding me? Are you serious? I think out of all the examples, this by far was the biggest fumble of them all. Girl, you could have had half of that. You could have had $30 million. You tripping. You big tripping. If you are not familiar with that whole situation, I'm going to have links for each of the podcasts that I speak on today, just so you guys can go and look at the deep dives, because I think that one is like interesting. This one I actually had to do research on, because I've never listened to or watched Call Her Daddy. But now it's kind of formatted a little differently. The co-host, that's a solo host now, she actually does a lot of interviews and stuff like that. So she's had like celebrities on her podcast. I'm trying to think. Jesus, who am I thinking of? She had Justin Bieber's wife on her podcast, and I can't, off the top of my head, I'm drawing a blank. I can't remember everybody that she's had on there, but she's definitely had white celebrities on her podcast. And then of course, like big YouTubers, things of that nature. Super popular. I might just have to give her a listen just to see like what she's talking about. But the other co-host did end up starting her own podcast, and it's not nearly as popular as Call Her Daddy. I think it's called Sophia with an F. I believe it's what her podcast is called, and her name was Sophia, and the one who's still on Call Her Daddy, I believe her name is Alex. I believe, just going off the top of the dome. No notes, no nothing. And with that podcast, once things were like kind of like falling apart, Alex did come out and say that she was doing the majority work on the podcast. She was the one who edited the podcast after they were done recording, and she was actually getting paid more than Sophia, and Sophia didn't know that she was getting paid more. It was the whole thing, girl. It was a whole thing. Excuse me. I apologize. I'm a little sickly, but not too sick. Just a little sniffles. Nothing too major. But yeah, so Alex was making more money. She said that she didn't feel comfortable telling Sophia about her pay raise because Sophia made her feel uncomfortable about her doing more work, about Alex doing more work than Sophia. Yeah, so that's like one of those things that you have to be aware of when dealing with friendship within business and with podcasting, which your podcast is a business, is you have to worry about those things, like feeling comfortable, like coming to your business partner and talking about things. I never really had that problem within my situation. I just, said how I felt eventually, at some point, try to even out the workload, even though that did not happen. I was basically the Alex in the situation. I definitely did majority of the work. I did like 90% of the work, but I'll get to that in a second. So the next podcast that I want to mention that were friends that did not survive their friendship or the podcast. And the same thing for Sophia and Alex. They're no longer friends. And they were best friends. Like, they were roommates and everything. And then they're not friends anymore. So the next one is going to be Righteous and Ratchet. And that was a podcast with Kevonni and Doughboy. And if you're unfamiliar with Kevonni, which you're probably not, he has like millions of followers, but yeah, so he's a Christian comedian, and he was at All Deaf Digital at one point, and then once All Deaf Digital ended, Doughboy was also at All Deaf Digital along with Patrick Cloud, To Hear More, Meg Scoop, CP. There's so many comedians that came from All Deaf. But pretty much that's how they met at All Deaf. Doughboy was also on Wildin' Out at one point. One of those seasons he was on there as well. And they came together. They made a podcast. They were best friends. And yeah, so right around the time that the panorama was panoraming, right in the beginning, they stopped filming episodes. They took a break. They were supposed to be taking a break from doing the podcast, and it was unclear to the viewers what was going on or like why they were taking a break. It was pretty much kind of framed like they were taking like a 6-month break or something close to that. It might have not been as long as 6 months. It might have been like 5 months or something like that, but it was supposed to be for a long period of time. And in the time frame that the podcast was on hiatus, Kevonni kind of came up with another podcast to fill in for the absence of Righteous and Ratchet. And the way that it was explained is because that Righteous and Ratchet had sponsorships that they were contractually obligated to do, which is why he started another podcast so he could fulfill those ads. So he started the podcast called Here's the Thing. Originally, it was just him by himself, and the producer, or Joshy Gons. Is he the producer? I don't know what to, like, he's kind of like a host on Here's the Thing, but like behind the camera, the engineer, I guess I'll say. Like, so Joshy Gons is the engineer of Righteous and Ratchet, and then later on Here's the Thing. So yeah, it was just Kevin by himself, and Kevin was like he needed to find another host because it was too much for him to do by himself. So he ended up hiring on Angel Lakita Moore Tanksley. Hold on, wait. Angel Lakita Moore Tanksley. That chick Angel, the actress, who is going to be on a Black Lady sketch comedy show on HBO. But yeah, so he hired her on as a co-host because he intentionally wanted to have a Black woman as a host because he just wanted to be diverse and not pick somebody that already has opportunities. He just wanted to give an opportunity to a Black woman. So he had Angel come on as a co-host, and y'all, it was magical. It's still going on. I love Here's the Thing. I literally watch Here's the Thing every single week. I'm even in the Patreon, so I get to watch it twice a week. But yes, like I personally like Here's the Thing a lot more than Righteous and Ratchet. And that's probably because Angel is a Black woman and I'm a Black woman and we can relate. I don't know. I just really like the dynamic of Kevin Stage and Angel. So, Here's the Thing became popular. From my perspective, it seemed like people were liking Here's the Thing more than Righteous and Ratchet, which I don't believe has anything to do with why Righteous and Ratchet did not come back. So they were doing their thing, and then suddenly, all of a sudden, it was announced to us that Righteous and Ratchet was not coming back, and that Kevin was taking Righteous and Ratchet off of his channel completely, and he gave all the episodes to Doughboy. It wasn't explained to us like why or anything like that, but it ended up coming out that Doughboy actually relapsed. He was a recovering alcoholic. He had been sober for like a couple years. So he did relapse during the pandemic, which is why they stopped filming. I'm not sure, like a lot of details weren't given to the public as to like if he was like going to rehab or anything like that. That information wasn't given to us, or if it was given to us like via Doughboy, I missed out on it. So I apologize. Me speaking on this situation, I'm just speaking strictly off my memory. I didn't do any research. But once it was kind of announced that Righteous and Ratchet wasn't coming back, we never seen Doughboy on anything that involved Kev on stage. So there's a podcast on the All Deaf Digital page, YouTube page, and it's a podcast on podcasting platforms called Squadcast, which kept on stage. It was Kept on Stage, To Hear More, Meg Scoop, Patrick Cloud, and Doughboy. Those are the original members of that podcast. So once this situation happened, Doughboy never came back to Squadcast. Like, anything that involved Kept on Stage, like, Doughboy was not there. And just from the outside looking in, it kind of just seemed like that whole clique just like didn't fuck with him no more. Like, I remember there was a post that To Hear More had made on his Instagram page, and Doughboy was in it, and it was after this situation happened, but you could tell that it was like previously recorded before anything happened. And, people were in the comments, and they were like, isn't this peculiar? So it was a time, like, you had to be there. I'm not going to be able to go back. Like, this stuff happened so long ago. Like, I'm not going to be able to go back and look it up. Like, I'm not going to go on To Hear More's Instagram page and scroll back 2 years ago to figure out what post it was and what the comments said. I'm not about to do all that. But if I can find like a deep dive on this whole situation, I will post a link in the description for you all to go and watch on your own accord. But yeah, I mean, we just never seen them together again. We really don't know what happened as far as their friendship and why they're no longer friends. But, just like in the last situation, like, Doughboy, he really fumbled the friendship and fumbled the bag. Because, like, sir, like, what are you doing? Like, I honestly, it's very interesting to watch Doughboy end up coming up with several podcasts after Righteous and Ratchet. He had one with, what is her name? Shantae Waynes, I think is her name. She's one of the Waynes nieces. I don't know who her daddy is, but she's in the Waynes family, and she's a stud, and she's a comedian. She's funny. He had a podcast with her. He had a podcast with a few other people. But none of them panned out. None of them, like, he wasn't. I mean, honestly, when you're starting something like a podcast or just anything new in general, you have to kind of let it grow. And with Kevin on Stage, he has a huge following. He has a huge audience that's like super dedicated to him, and they're like invested. Doughboy doesn't have the same type of audience that Kevin on Stage has. And with him coming out with so many podcasts, I feel like people didn't get invested, because it's kind of like, after the first and the second one, it's like, okay, I'm watching this. Like, why watch the third one if you're just going to stop? Like, he had a podcast with his daughter as well. So he really had a whole lot of podcasts, and none of them really panned out. And I think they didn't pan out because people don't want to get invested in something just for it to be canceled. Like I said, Here's the Thing has been out for over 2 years at this point, almost 2.5 years. And I consistently have been watching this show every week since it came out. I'm not going to watch a podcast that's going to be only out for 3 months and then it's going to be canceled. Like, I'm not even going to get emotionally attached to it. And I feel like that is one of the issues that Doughboy currently has within the projects that he's working on. It's, I think he's looking for those numbers from Righteous and Ratchet. And it's like, you're not going to get those numbers because, you don't have the same audience as Kevin on Stage. So the people who came in to Righteous and Ratchet for you, they're going to stick with you if you be consistent. Like, consistency is everything. After that, Kevin on Stage came out with his own app. He just recently released a TV show that he produced and wrote called Churchy on his app. So it's a streaming service app. They have a lot of good content on there. So they have, I'm trying to think. So they have all original content that is produced by Kevin on Stage. His wife Melissa has a dating show that I can't think of the name of right now. They also did a food show called What's Good where they went to different cities and tried different restaurants. And my state, Virginia, was on there. So they did a What's Good Virginia Beach. And I definitely want to check out those restaurants. I haven't been to Virginia Beach recently, just because I just haven't had the time, or, whatever. It doesn't matter. But yeah, I definitely want to check out those restaurants that he featured on the episode. And then they have like a comedians challenge show with To Hear More, Tony Baker, Angel, and Kevin on stage. And then sometimes they'll have, like if one of the comedians can't be there, they have like Patrick Cloud subbed in a couple of times. I can't remember who else subbed in, but it's good content. And of course, it's just starting now. He literally just started the app a year ago. So I'm interested to see how that pans out. But I mean, Kevin Stage is getting that bag. Okay. So him and Angel have another podcast together with their spouses called The Bald and the Beautiful. And I also watch that as well. I really like that. And they just have like a whole little thing going on over there. Like, Kevin Stage Studios is legit. Like, they got a lot going on over there. They have a lot of talent. It's flourishing. Doughboy, I really don't know like what he's up to these days. I do know he had those few podcasts. I did watch a couple episodes of those podcasts that he did release, but it just seems like he has a hard time kind of sticking to one thing, and I think he just needs to hone in on one thing and just stick with it and let it ride out for a year before he decides that he doesn't want to do it anymore. But yeah, so then that's my second example of a friendship that didn't pan out so well, and as a result, the podcast also dissolved. So within the first example, Call Her Daddy, the friendship fell apart because of the podcast. In this situation with Righteous and Ratchet, the podcast dissolved because the friendship dissolved. And our third example is going to be probably the one you would be most familiar with if you're my target demographic, which once again, Black women. You'll probably be super familiar with the falling out of the Joe Budden podcast. Super big deal. It was the drama. The drama was real. Like, the drama was crispy. It was a nice, crispy, juicy gossip. Like, so, yeah. So I used to be a listener of the Joe Budden podcast. I stopped listening to them back in 2019. And I was very shocked and surprised to find out that they was over there beefing. They was big beefing. Like, crazy beefing. So pretty much the gist of the story is so it was Joe Budden, of course, the Joe Budden podcast, Mal, and Rory. So 3 people podcast. There are other people that sometimes talk on the podcast, but those were the 3 people that were on camera. Joe had a disagreement with Rory and Mal, but Rory was more vocal than Mal was, from my understanding of the situation. So pretty much they wanted to see the accounting for the show because they felt like they weren't being fairly compensated. They just wanted to know. I don't even think it was they thought they weren't being fairly compensated. I think they just wanted to see what was happening, what was going on as far as the money that they were promised. And pretty much Joe Budden didn't want to give them a detailed, itemized list of what was happening on the books for accounting. And because of that, first he told Rory, like, you go ahead and you take a break from the podcast. Because he told Rory to take a break from the podcast, Mal was like, well, if Rory's not recording, I'm not recording either. Yeah, so pretty much Rory and Mal were on strike. While they were on strike, Joe Budden basically replaced them, to make a long story less long. And eventually Rory and Mal came back. They did a very awkward episode. They did an awkward 2 episodes. And this is when I tuned back in to the Joe Budden podcast, because I just had to know what was happening and what was going on. I wanted to, hear. So they did an episode coming back, kind of explaining to the public what was happening without giving too many details. And so they came back together. We thought everything was going to be on the up and up, and, they was going to work through their issues, and then Rory and Mal were gone again. Yeah, so very shortly after coming back, they were gone again. And pretty much once they were gone, Joe fired Rory from the podcast, and Mal just didn't come back. So Rory and Mal started their own podcast before, I guess, the establishing, the first episode of Rory and Mal was them pretty much stating their perspective on what happened in the situation with Joe. I don't know if that episode is still available to the public. It might just be on their Patreon now. I don't know. If it is available, I'll link it in the description. But, honestly, I didn't know how things would go with just a podcast with Rory and Mal. Because if you ever heard the Joe Budden podcast before, when they were on there, Joe kind of just takes over. He takes over everything that he's on. So I originally started watching the Joe Budden podcast because I was watching this show with him in academics that I can't remember the name of at the moment. But once Joe left that show, I stopped watching that show, and I started watching the Joe Budden podcast from there. And honestly, I thought Rory and Mal were boring. But I guess next to Joe Budden hooping and hollering, yelling and screaming, who else could possibly compete? But now that Rory and Mal are on their own podcast, I actually listen to Rory and Mal more than I listen to the Joe Budden podcast. I listened to an episode of Rory and Mal last week. I cannot tell you the last time I listened to the Joe Budden podcast. I'll listen to them every now and then. They post segments on YouTube. Their podcast episodes are really long. They're 2 or 3 hours long. So when they're talking about a specific topic, they'll post that 10 to 15 minute clip on YouTube, and sometimes I'll watch that. But I haven't listened to a whole episode of the Joe Budden podcast in months. I definitely have listened to a couple episodes, or a few episodes, I should say, this year. But I more so listened to Rory and Mal. I feel like Rory and Mal leaving the Joe Budden podcast was really good for them, because it allowed them to really shine and have their true personalities come out without having to listen to Joe Budden hoop, holler, yell, and scream and turn red and his fucking veins popping out. I did not know they were so funny until they were on their own. So I think that's been very super good, beneficial for them. They literally just went on a podcast tour. They're doing really well for themselves. They constantly chart in the top 10 for music podcasts. Joe Budden also still ranks high up in the podcast charts as well, but they're not too far behind him. They could potentially pass him. I could see that being a thing, because it's just good vibes. The vibes are A1 over there. I don't know. Joe that man he said he in therapy, but whoo child. Some things never change. Some people never change. It is what it is. But yeah, from that, I feel how we can summarize the breakdown of that podcast / relationship friendship is business definitely got in the way. That's definitely one of the things you have to worry about when you're starting businesses with friends and family. Money is the root of all evil. It's not even money. It's people wanting money. It's the root of all evil. People wanting power is the root of the evil. But the money was funny. And, I feel like Rory and Mal made the best decision for themselves. And they parted ways. And I think that they're happier now without having Joe there. But if you have time to watch the deep dive on this one is definitely the most interesting. It's really crazy. There's like allegations of Rory threatening DJ Academics, and it's just nuts. It's crazy. It's a lot. It's a lot. If you got time to watch, oh girl, I'll find a deep dive for y'all because I watched a deep dive on it. Listen, these deep dives, they're not short. I'm trying to give y'all a little brief overview of what had happened, but these overviews, they're like an hour and a half long, just to warn you. But if you ain't doing that and you cleaning your house or something like that, definitely listen to the deep dives, okay? Because, oh girl, clutch your invisible pearls, okay? So that leads me to my own situation as far as my podcast and what happened and what advice I would give someone else who's starting a podcast with a friend. All right, so let's get into my podcast, how it started, all that good stuff. So the podcast I'm on currently was always a thought in my head, not always, but it was a concept and a thought that I had in my head prior to me coming out with the first podcast that I ended up coming out with. So I thought of the name More Than Couture over a year ago. I don't even know when, where, how, I don't know when I came up with the name or anything like that. It's just been on my heart to start this podcast. I eventually met the person that I ended up making a podcast with, and we talked about, we worked together. And prior to now, I was a trainer for call centers. I worked at a couple call centers that I was a trainer at. And he was also a trainer, and we trained a couple classes together. So we were paired together for a little while, for maybe like a month and a half. We worked together, maybe 2 months, something like that, where we were working together to do classes together. So while we were working together, we were both into fashion. We had similar interests, and we discussed more about coming up with a podcast. Some of the people who were in our class, they were like, oh, you guys should start a podcast together. You guys, work really well together, yada, yada, yada. So we was like, okay, cool. We threw the idea around of, starting a podcast, and it just definitely came up because, people are creative. A lot of people are creative, especially when you work in call centers. A little bit of everything comes through there. So, of course, people who are creative and, we're talking about podcasts. It was one class in particular where we were speaking on doing a podcast and all that stuff. And some of the people that were in the class were speaking on starting their own podcast and all that good stuff. And so we decided we were going to go ahead and start a podcast together. It would be a fashion podcast. He came up with the name of the podcast. When we started the podcast, I thought I was very straightforward on what I wanted as far as the podcast goes. Like, I wanted everything to, legally be his. So I wanted him to own the name, the trademarks, LLCs, whatever business stuff was involved with the podcast, I wanted it to be in his name, because at this point I'm already Kevonni Couture, I already have an established brand. I wanted that to just be something that I was featured on, not something that I was heavily not invested in, because I'm invested in everything that I do, but I just wanted it to be like something that I do, not something that I created. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I should say I'm not sure how to articulate exactly what's going on up here in my noggin. So I'm already Kevonni Couture. I already have over 100,000 followers on TikTok. You know, I'm building my brand as Kevonni Couture. I just wanted that to be like a notch on my belt, I guess you could say, but not really like a main platform of mine, I guess you could say. Because like I said, I always wanted to start this podcast, More Than Couture, which I wanted to be like my main podcast, because it is my podcast. So in the beginning, I thought it was clear about that, like about me having my own brand and that just being something in addition to my brand, but me not putting a whole lot of my brand into it. But yeah, that's not how things went. So pretty much I did the majority of the work. Unfortunately, it was not an even split at all. It wasn't even close to an even split. If I'm being honest, I would say when it comes to that podcast, I contributed 75% or more. I would even say 80 to 90% of the podcast was my doing. And what I mean by that is the location that the podcast was shot at was my home. The equipment that was used was mine. Like, originally, we went half and half on the original equipment that we bought to start the podcast, but we ended up not using that equipment to do the podcast. So we ended up buying new mics, which is one of the mics in my hand. I bought one mic, my dad bought the other mic. And the lights, the camera, the tripod, everything was mine. The computer, the software, everything was mine. Everything, all that was mine. Post-production, actually, well, let's rewind it back. Even setting up the podcast, like I would set everything up prior to him coming to my house to film. And some days he would help with like taking things down and putting things back where they go, but it wasn't every single time. I would say it was about half, like 50% of the time he would help me take things down and put things back, and sometimes he did it. Like, he would always take the table back to the kitchen, but for the most part, most of the setup and takedown was me. We did have wine. As far as like getting wine and food, I would say we went 50-50 on that as far as that goes. Like, sometimes I would get the food, sometimes he would. Sometimes I would buy wine, sometimes he would. One time we took a trip to the store to get wine and we just split it 50-50. But yeah, post-production, that was 100% me. I did everything as far as post-production was concerned. As far as setting up all the accounts and everything, I did all of that. The social media posts, I made those. Yeah, as far as like making the content, that was mostly me. We collaborated as far as what topics we would talk about. Then, of course, actually filming itself, we were both talent. And yeah, I mean, it was a lot. It was a lot. It was a lot for me. It was a lot. And I try to make it more even by sharing the responsibility as far as assigning tasks to the other person. And what that looked like for me is, well, I'm already doing all this other stuff. Can you respond to the comments on the YouTube channel, the Instagram page? Can you post to the Instagram page? I'm going to create the content and you post it. And yeah, it was a learning experience for me. I can say what I took away from that is I learned how to make a podcast. And yeah, I mean that's what I learned. I mean, I learned that I will probably never go into business with any of my friends ever again. Also, because I'm just such a control freak, like I don't know about this. So just, yeah, but it was rough. It was really rough, and I wanted it to be easier than it was. Like, we had a lot of struggles and things, like the software that I used to edit. I had a lot of problems with it. So far, so good as far as this goes. I haven't had any issues yet. I found better ways to get done the things that I had issues with in the past when I was doing that podcast. So it was just, I learned a lot. Ultimately, it was supposed to be a fashion podcast, and we were talking about celebrity gossip. And you guys, I'm not a celebrity gossip girl. That is not me. That's why I don't talk about current events on this podcast. Not that y'all will know this because it's only the second episode, but I don't talk about celebrity gossip because I'm not into it. So finding topics and stuff to talk about was kind of a struggle for me because I'm just like, I'm not into any of this. I don't know what's going on. So we took a break from recording episodes, and that was because I was having technical issues getting the podcast out. I was having a lot of technical issues, which is really crazy because the technical issues I was having then, I'm not having now, and it's mind blowing to me. Y'all don't know. Like, it's crazy. It's really crazy to me. But so we took a break because we were having technical issues. Like, we recorded episodes and I wasn't able to get them out because of the technical issues that I was having as far as getting the footage to my computer and getting it edited and all that stuff. While we were on a break, I ended up working a job that I had to go out of town for. So the days that we recorded the podcast, I wasn't here. That was another reason why the podcast didn't come back. While we were on this hiatus, we discussed redirecting content for the podcast, which was something that I really wanted to do because we were supposed to be a fashion-based podcast, and our podcast mostly revolved around celebrity gossip. And I wasn't with it. And I was just like, I want evergreen content. And if you don't know what evergreen content is, it's basically content that doesn't have an expiration date. Like, when you're talking about celebrity gossip, it's a trend. It fades very quickly. With evergreen content, we're talking about Versace and how the brand got started. That's evergreen content. It has no end date. It has no expiration date. Anybody could look up or be interested in how Versace got started. And that's the kind of content that I wanted to make. And I expressed that to my co-host. He agreed. So that's the direction that we were going to go into once we got the podcast back up and running, we were trying to decide on a new look for the podcast, which is what you guys are seeing now, which is me in this room with these gray walls. I haven't gotten everything that I wanted to get as far as redecorating this room, but I'm about to wait for me to buy new curtains and new furniture to start recording. And I think I would have came to that same conclusion with the other podcast as well. We just never came back because there was a decline in the friendship. So yeah, it never came back. So if it would have came back, it would have went in a different direction than what we were currently doing. I wanted to actually talk about fashion-based things. That's what I wanted for the podcast. And some of the topics that I picked, I may still talk about on this podcast. Just because, why not? But honestly, would I ever start a podcast with another friend after this? I would if I was not responsible for the editing and getting the content out. I would. As far as editing, getting the content out, social media, all that stuff is concerned, if I have to do any of that, I'm out. I'm not doing it. I have enough running my own pages. Like, that is enough work for me on its own. Me doing my own podcast and editing that, like, I have enough work cut out for me already without me having to have additional tasks put on my list. And I feel like me doing the podcast and putting so much effort into the podcast took away from me developing my brand into what I want it to be. Like, I'm still not there yet, still working on it, but I don't know how I was going to do it. But I did plan on still coming out with More Than Couture, and I was still going to do the other podcast as well. I was going to have them come out simultaneously at the same time. Side by side. So I had planned on the other podcast coming out on a Friday or Saturday, whatever day it was coming out on, and having this podcast coming out on Sunday. So within the weekend, but just a different day. Honestly, glad that's not the case, because it would have been very overwhelming for me. And honestly, I probably never would have gotten to this podcast if things continued the way they were continuing and my life going the way that it's currently going. I probably wouldn't have time to do 2 podcasts. But yeah, I'm literally just getting started with this podcast. I'm just getting used to being by myself. Eventually I will have guests on here, and that's a big focus of mine, is getting guests. But for now, I just want to get some content out there and get my footing with being alone and by myself. And here I am. Here she is. Here is More Than Couture. And if I had to give somebody else advice on starting a podcast with their friend, I would say make sure that the work is evenly divided. Make sure you guys have a contract in place about whose responsibility is what. And revisit your contract frequently. Like, reevaluate, especially within your first year, reevaluate your contract every 3 months. Each quarter, making sure that you're learning from what you're doing and just getting a new contract. Like, okay, this contract is for 3 months. Let's follow this for 3 months get to the end of your 3 months, evaluate what you guys had happen in the first quarter, add things into your contract, take things out. Yeah, I mean, I would just say reevaluate what you're doing as you're going along for your first year of your podcast, and make sure you and your friend are on the same page, and make sure you both you're fulfilled with what you're doing, because if you're not fulfilled in what you're doing, it's going to become like a chore for you to do. And the whole point of doing it is for it to be fun. So I hope that you all learned something from this video about starting a podcast with your friend and the type of things that can go wrong within for your friendship and the podcast. I hope this was helpful for someone. Yeah. If you guys have any suggestions on topics that you guys want me to talk about, or any questions that you have in regards to starting a podcast with a friend or just starting a podcast in general, please feel free to ask me those questions in the comments on YouTube. If you're not watching on YouTube, just go over there, type your question, and just, go about your business. But yeah, so you can definitely watch the podcast on Spotify or YouTube, and you can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Anchor, and Apple Podcast app. That's where I'm at right now. I'm working on getting the podcast out on other platforms, but I just need time to set up all that stuff on the other platforms, but that's where I'm at right now, as of today. Yeah. Also, subscribe, but also follow me on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Pinterest. Yeah. Follow me on those places. And yeah, I will see you guys next week on another episode of More Than Couture. Period. Bye.